To set the scene for us, before we start those discussions, we want to hear a little bit about worldwide trends in MSP globally, and then, as I say, we will hear some particular examples. So to do that, I'm delighted to welcome to the stage Charles Ehler, who is IOC Senior International MSP Consultant. Charles, it is great to have you with us, sir. Thank you very much for being here. So as I say, this to give you some context. What does the picture look like worldwide? And that will give us the backdrop against which we consider how to achieve successful MSP. Charles, a very warm welcome, sir, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Jackie, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. March 15th is an auspicious day. It's the Ides of March. For any of you who are history fans, it's the day that Julius Caesar was assassinated. And that certainly changed the way the world worked. We're here today with hopes that we can also change the world. In fact, a large part of the world, at least 70% of the world's surface is the ocean. And we want to be able to manage it the way that it should be, due to its value. I hope you all agree after my presentation that we've made substantial progress in developing tools and processes like marine spatial planning. And I want to show you some data that I hope will substantiate what I'm saying in terms of how much progress we've made. What we've done over the last 10 years is basically take a concept that we had in 2006 with a little bit of experience in a few countries and make it into a practical approach to moving towards sustainable development of the oceans. We've got about 20 countries now working on marine spatial planning in various stages of development, and they have implemented many plans already in the last 10 years. By 2030, it's very possible that we could have at least a third of the world's oceans, a third of the world's EEZs under government-approved marine spatial plans. But much remains to be done. It would be good if we had someone like this who could help us with marine spatial planning, who could make the trade-offs, determine what the balance should be. But unfortunately, this person does not exist, or this institution does not exist. So we need marine spatial planning. As has been previously mentioned, demand for goods and services from the ocean has increased dramatically. It will increase even more over the next decade. And it often exceeds the capacity of marine areas to meet all of these demands simultaneously. In many cases, users have free access to ocean resources, including ocean space. And this often leads to overuse, to conflicts, and eventual degradation of some marine resources. Okay, thank you. And since many of the goods and services that exist in the oceans, for example, ecosystem services, are not traded in the market, we need something besides the market to deal with these kinds of economic trade-offs. Some public process has to be used to decide what mix of products, of goods and services from the marine area should be produced over time and space. And that process, in fact, is marine spatial planning. Marine spatial planning has certain kinds of characteristics. It's place-based, that's pretty obvious. It's based on regions, on whole nations. It's participatory. It's multi-objective and integrated. It is not only marine conservation, but it's trying to balance marine conservation with economic development. It's ecosystem-based. It's continuing and adaptive, which is very important because this is not a one-time kind of planning effort. It's something that has to take place over time, and we have to learn how to adapt and determine what works and what doesn't work. There are about 150 countries of the world's 195 countries that have marine areas, that have an EEZ. It's about 140 million square kilometers, the world's EEZs, and the world's high seas, which we're also going to talk about in a few minutes, is about 220 million square kilometers. EEZs represent about 40% of the ocean. High seas are about 60% of the ocean. So the first question I want to sort of address is where were we in the year 2006 when we had our first international workshop? Well, we were pretty far along, actually. We didn't know where we were because many of these people had never talked to each other, but our first workshop brought together about 48 people, to talk about the progress that had been made to date in marine spatial planning. China had already started their work on marine functional zoning. Germany, Sweden, and Finland were working on a project sponsored by the EU called the Baltic Coast Project that included territorial sea planning. The United Kingdom was working on some of its early days of maritime spatial planning. And in fact, I would credit the United Kingdom in one of their reports where they said they would explore the role of spatial planning for actually coming up with the term marine or maritime spatial planning. There were a number of things going on. There were some countries that actually had developed a plan. Belgium was one of the first that actually put a plan out. Australia had a plan for a multiple use plan for one of its regions, but the plan was never approved by government. Germany had a plan at the Länder level, at the provincial state level, that was approved. And the Netherlands, of course, had some work done prior to or around 2005. In 2006, we did have our first international workshop. It was recognized several times as sort of the starting point of marine spatial planning internationally. And we produced a number of reports that Vladimir has already mentioned in terms of a step-by-step kind of guide to marine spatial planning. The EU was also doing quite separately from what IOC was doing. They were working on things like an overall strategic plan, a blue paper that was proposing integrated marine policy, and one of the pillars of that policy was to be maritime spatial planning. The European Commission published a roadmap for marine spatial planning in 2008, a study on the economic effects of maritime spatial planning in 2011, and in fact, most importantly, and it's been mentioned several times already, the big impetus to actual implementation of marine spatial planning has now come from a directive in 2014, a maritime spatial planning directive. Directive in Europe is the equivalent of legislation that will require all of the member states to have a maritime spatial plan by 2021. So, where are we now in 2017? Where are we today? Well, we have a lot of countries. There are about 60 countries that are working on maritime spatial planning, marine or maritime spatial planning. 7 in Africa, 4 in Oceania, 25 in Europe. That's not just the European Union, but also Norway and other countries that are in Europe doing marine or maritime spatial planning. A couple of countries in the Middle East now doing marine planning. North America, that would be Canada, the United States, and Mexico, all have work underway, much of it completed. A lot of new interest in Central America and the Caribbean, and some new interest in South America. This shows the regional distribution of what these initiatives make up in terms of different regions. By far the biggest component of this, the biggest slice of the pie, is in Europe. Europe has started marine spatial planning and, in fact, are still leading the charge in many ways. Where are we with respect to these initiatives? Again, 60 initiatives underway around the world. About 40%, 37% are in what I would call the pre-planning stage, just getting authority, finding money to get started, determining what stakeholders should be involved in the process, etc. About a third are actually in the plan preparation stage. They've got plans underway, but not completed or approved. About 20%, 1 in 5, actually have an approved plan now in terms of these 60 initiatives around the world. And a little over 10% are actually revising their plans. The Netherlands, for example, has had 3 rounds of planning, 3 rounds of learning about what works and what doesn't work, and adapting their own plan. This is just a set of maps that show where the Netherlands was in 2005, around 2010, another revision of their plan, and then finally a third plan was just released last year for 2016, a plan for the next 5 years. So continuing and adaptive management is possible and is taking place in places like the Netherlands. This is a chart of plan approvals by year through 2016. As you can see, in the early days, there was not very much happening. I think Vladimir mentioned that the Great Barrier Reef was one of the first large marine areas to initiate marine spatial planning, and they did that over time. It took a long time to do that, but they had a series of zoning maps for the Great Barrier Reef that sort of set the stage for work that later on was taken up, again, primarily in Europe. Belgium, the Netherlands, Norway, Mexico, these are all countries that were doing planning already, had completed a round of planning by the time our first workshop took place. China came along in the following year, 2 years later, in 2008, with provincial plans of covering their territorial sea that were zoning maps, marine functional zoning maps. And you can see progress for the rest of the time. I'm often asked, what's the right scale? What is the appropriate scale for marine spatial planning? And the simple answer is there is no appropriate scale. It takes place at a variety of scales, in some cases covering the entire exclusive economic zone of a country, in others a more regionally focused plan. And some of the early initial work that was done in Southeast Asia was at the municipal level that covered marine areas as well. So about 10% are really local kinds of plans, and a little bit over half of the plans cover the entire exclusive economic zone. And again, this can range from places like Australia, with a very large EEZ that has 5 planning regions that have now completed a plan for their area, down to countries that are just doing it at the territorial sea level. We hear a lot about transboundary kinds of issues and transboundary planning, and the reality is that there hasn't been much transboundary planning that has taken place. It's very difficult to try to cooperate with your neighbor if your neighbor already has a plan and you have no plan, in fact have no idea what marine spatial planning is all about. So it's been a difficult process to try and bring countries together to work across boundaries, but it is happening. And in some cases, even within large marine areas, like this is the northeastern part of the United States, there's been a lot of transboundary planning within one country, a little bit with Canada, but primarily within one country. But within this area, within this space, there are 12 states that are doing marine planning and are cooperating now in this overall effort. There are 9 federal agencies, again, administrative kinds of boundaries. There are 2 fishery management councils that are dealing with this particular space. And there are a group of American Indian tribes that also have interests and are participating in planning. So it's not just transboundary across countries, but even within some countries you have a very complex kind of situation. There's often a criticism of marine spatial planning that it's a top-down process. Okay? It comes from the national government. Local governments are not very much involved, even some state governments or provincial level governments not involved. This is an example of a project that has been basically built from the ground up, from the community level up. The coastal First Nations, again, indigenous peoples of British Columbia, and the province of British Columbia have developed this plan for their entire west coast of Canada. And in fact, it's not just one plan, or will be one plan, but it started out by 4 separate plans by these different coastal First Nations. And you're going to hear more about this particular effort and many of the others that I've already mentioned in panels as we go through the conference. Those are the 4 plans that have already been developed. What drives marine spatial planning or maritime spatial planning? Why are we doing this? Well, we've done a survey of a lot of the initiatives that I already mentioned. Conflicts among human uses seems to be the biggest driver. 82% of the respondents to our survey said that that's why we're doing marine spatial planning. You didn't have to just pick one, so there are some overlap here in terms of which initiatives we are actually counting here. The need for a more integrated approach was often mentioned as why we do marine spatial planning. Marine conservation concerns, okay? Marine conservation concerns particularly in the face of new and emerging human uses of marine areas. And then there are conflicts between uses, human uses, and nature. Conflicts between, for example, sand and gravel mining and fisheries habitats, fish habitats. Economic growth concerns continue to be relatively high in terms of why we do this. And finally, a couple of other categories, including the effects of climate change, is driving many new initiatives with respect to spatial planning. We would like to have planning have teeth, right? And the way that planning has teeth usually is through regulations. So the question is, how many of our marine planning efforts actually are regulatory, and how many of them are strategic or advisory? And this is the breakout. Less than half, in fact, are actually regulatory plans. The rest are advisory. 60% are advisory. Now that sounds like it might be sort of a weak approach, but the fact is that even the strategic planning often is implemented through existing authorities, and those authorities are regulatory. So just because they're advisory plans in terms of their characterization, they may very well have enough clout to change the way we do business in the ocean. Belgium is an example of a country, relatively small EEZ, but an intensely used exclusive economic zone. And in 2003, 2005, they developed a voluntary plan that actually was manifested in a zoning plan, but it was a voluntary zoning plan. There was no real authority to do this, and it took another 9 years in 2014 to actually develop a marine spatial plan for Belgium, which is a regulatory plan. Right? This zoning map on the right-hand side of the diagram is basically a law. How does marine spatial planning relate to coastal zone management? Right? We've had coastal zone management for 40 or 50 years in many countries. How do we plan marine areas now so that they can line up with what we have done on land, where we actually have a coastal zone management plan? It's about 50-50 with respect to whether or not marine spatial plans are addressing this land-sea integration issue. Germany has a very nice solution to this problem. I think Germany and Sweden may also have the same approach, and that is that the Länder, the states in Germany, have authority out to the 12 nautical mile limit. Okay? So the same institutions that are dealing with coastal management problems on land also have the authority to go to sea out to 12 miles and develop an integrated plan, overall plan. And that has happened, again, particularly in places like Germany. Now, the third part of my talk is, where do we want to be in 2030? We've come a long way. We have a lot of experience under our belt. We've learned a lot of lessons. And what do we do next? Well, one thing we want to do is think a little bit more about the future, right? If we're going to try to figure out where we're going and what we want to do, we have to think about the future. And in fact, many marine spatial plans don't do a very good job of addressing future issues, future uses, where those kinds of conflicts might occur that are not occurring today. A lot of our work so far has been on basically documenting where we are, not where we want to be. Okay? This is one plan that is about to come out. Unfortunately, no one from the United Arab Emirates could come to the meeting to talk about this plan, but I was involved in the plan itself. And it really developed scenarios about what were the different possibilities if you maximize certain values, that what would the maritime region of Abu Dhabi, which was the area of planning, what would be the implications of these different kinds of maximizing economic value or maximizing environmental values, and coming up with a desired scenario, a desired spatial scenario of what we wanted this area to look like over time, in this case 20 years. So it is possible to think about the future and actually to act on the future through in a planning context. This is where we're going in terms of at least a reasonable projection of things that are already in the pipeline. There are 150 countries that have marine waters, and there are, there are about 60 countries that are now actively working on plans. By 2030, we're estimating that there will probably be 80 countries that are working on marine spatial plans. That's a pretty steep increase. And again, much of it is dependent on the European Union's, European Commission's marine spatial planning, maritime spatial planning directive to have this big uptick in terms of the number of countries that are involved in planning. This is probably the most interesting slide, or at least I hope you think it's the most interesting slide of how much of the world's exclusive economic zones are likely to be covered by the year 2030. Back in 2006, we had something like 0.3% of the area of the world's EEZs covered by a plan, and that included places like Australia, Belgium, and the Netherlands. By 2010, we were up to 3%. 2015, about now, we have 10% of the surface area of the world's EEZs covered by government-approved marine spatial plans. These are not pilot projects. They're not projects that are being done in an academic environment. They are government-approved plans, now covering about 10%, 22% over the next few years, and then again, because of this steep increase that we see due to the MSP directive of the EU, we will have even more plans approved, up to 40%, and then possibly as much as half of the world's EEZs covered by 2030. So the question becomes, what's the target? What should we be thinking about in terms of marine spatial planning or maritime spatial planning? We do have targets for marine protected areas. I think you're familiar with those. They range from 10% to 20%, even talk of 30% of the world's oceans under marine protected areas. So I think one of the things that we could come up with at this conference would be a target or a goal of having about a third, at least, that would be very conservative, a third of the area of the world's exclusive economic zones covered by government-approved maritime or marine spatial plans. So very quickly, I'll go through a few conclusions about planning as it exists today. Only a few countries actually have authority to do marine planning, explicit authority that says you will do marine spatial planning. That is going to change again, and already is changing with the EU directive. It will increase substantially. It takes about 3 or 4 years to do a marine plan. That's, again, based on experience. The costs of doing marine planning vary widely. But there's one thing that's very clear, and that is that marine spatial planning is not free. It does cost hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars to actually do a marine plan. Most countries rely on government funding to do the plan. But some, like China, have a very creative way of financing their marine spatial planning efforts through user charges. Other cases exist where foundations, like the Moore Foundation and others, have contributed substantial amounts of money to making marine planning a reality. Almost all marine spatial plans claim to have stakeholder engagement, but it varies widely from state to state, or from nation to nation. Most plans are advisory and strategic, as I already pointed out, but that may or may not be a problem. And while we talk about integrated planning, we don't always put that into practice. In many cases, fishing, for example, is not included in marine spatial plans. And as importantly, marine protected areas are often done in a quite separate process. And the idea in terms of thinking about how do we integrate these better is to have an integrated process that deals not only with fishing and all economic activities, but marine conservation as well, like marine protected areas. Almost all initiatives say that they're ecosystem-based. And again, it's difficult to measure that, to determine whether or not they really are ecosystem-based. So we need to do a better job of what that really means and how do we do ecosystem-based marine spatial planning. Most management objectives of marine spatial plans today are poorly specified in terms of objectives. So monitoring and evaluation of planning that we always talk about as important can't really be done very well if we are going to not have monitoring and evaluation integrated into the planning process. And again, there are very few transboundary examples that we can use as prototypes for marine spatial planning. Now, just a few challenges to think about with respect to where we're going in the conference over the next few days. Marine spatial planning doesn't take place in a vacuum, right? It takes place in a planning context that involves a lot of other planning efforts, whether it's land use planning, coastal zone planning, water basin planning, sectoral management authorities, et cetera. We have to figure out a better way to integrate marine spatial planning with all of these other efforts. We talk about moving toward a blue economy, right? That's sort of the latest brand that we want to put on marine spatial planning. But how can we ensure that all of these investments that we want to have and other management actions actually are going to result in a sustainable blue economy that will include restoring and maintaining ecosystem services? So that will be a challenge that we have to face if we're going to do blue economy planning. Incorporating the future into marine spatial planning, I've already mentioned that. We don't really do a great job in terms of where we want to be, defining where we want to be. We're very good at sort of saying where we are, but we have to do a better job on where we want to be. Monitoring and evaluation of marine plans. Now, what is a successful marine plan? That's still a very open discussion in most countries. And if we had better objectives and we could say we were actually achieving objectives that we laid out in the planning process, we would be able to determine whether or not the plans not only were effective, but we'd also be able to look at the costs and benefits and the distribution of those costs and benefits into planning. And finally, two place-based kinds of ideas that I think are sort of pretty obvious. One is marine spatial planning in the Arctic. Okay? We have a lot of assessments of issues in the Arctic. We've been doing assessments for 10 or 15 years. We have no plan, no integrated plan for the Arctic region of the world. And that is certainly one that as climate change takes place, as development opportunities arise, it's certainly an area where some effort should be made to put together a marine plan for the Arctic. And then finally, one of the topics that we're going to have in the workshop is marine spatial planning in the high seas. Again, this does not exist now, but there has been a lot of work in terms of thinking about how we could actually implement marine spatial planning in the high seas. So that's basically the end of what I have to say. I just wanted to point to one place where a lot of this information already exists, and that is a website that we've developed within the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission. That's the URL for that website. It's one that we've just recently updated pretty thoroughly. We're continuing to work on that. And that's the end of my discussion.
Thank you very much indeed, Charles. Thank you. Thank you so much for that incredibly comprehensive and fascinating insight into the trends, how we started, how we got to where we are, and crucially, those challenges and questions for the future that Charles outlined so eloquently.